Good morning, Eden. So glad that you could be with us today. I'm Josh. I'm here with Josh Stovers, and we're here today with a friend of ours, Kiara. Kiara is a student at Hills Adventist College who's giving work experience with us pastors a go, and hopefully we don't scare her off from that. But yeah, we created the Good Morning Eden podcast so that we could help you see things God's way. Start seeing things the way that God originally intended us to view the world, through the Garden of Eden lens. And so we're excited to talk today about the book of Mark. We're up to Mark chapter 8, verse 1 to 26. So we're going to hand it over to Kiara, who's going to be our first guest reader of Scripture. So over to you.
Okay, Jesus feeds the 4,000. About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance." His disciples replied, "How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness?" Jesus asked, "How much bread do you have?" 7 loaves, they replied. Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found too, so Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 people in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had arrived, they came and started to argue with him. Testing him, they demanded that he show them a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. When he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, I will not give this generation any such sign." So he got back into the boat and left them, and he crossed to the other side of the lake. But the disciples had forgotten to bring any food. They had only 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. As they were crossing the lake, Jesus warned them, "Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod." At this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, "Why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or understand even yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? You have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed the 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up afterwards?" 12, they said. "And when I fed the 4,000 with 7 loaves, how many large baskets of leftovers did you pick up?" 7, they said. "Don't you understand yet?" he asked them. When they arrived at Bethsaida, some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Then, spitting on the man's eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked, "Can you see anything now?" The man looked around. "Yes," he said, "I see people, but I can't see them very clearly. They look like trees walking around." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again, and his eyes were opened. His sight was completely restored, and he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him away, saying, "Don't go back into the village on your way home."
Amazing. Thank you. Any quick reflections before you head off camera?
Practice Dalmanutha more.
Hey, don't worry. It doesn't come up much in the Bible.
Yep. It's a one-off.
It's a one-off. All right. Thank you so much, Kiara.
Thank you.
Cool. I like having guest readers. We should do that more often.
We should.
All right. Cool passage. And I think you get a bit of deja vu reading this, right? Because just 2 chapters ago, Jesus fed the 5,000, and now we're here feeding 4,000. I remember reading this. I was like, I swear we already covered this. I just totally forgot that this story happened twice. So
yeah. And then you have another weird healing story.
Yeah, with some not COVID safe healing, you know. So I don't know what's up with Jesus and these like these like couple of chapters with these like spit miracles, but you know what? We're just rolling with it. So
Hey, it is what it is.
it is. All right. Well, yeah, let's dive into it. There's
Yeah.
like some real cool stuff to cover in here. And again, some linked stories as well, particularly the healing at the end has a really cool link. So yeah, I'm actually really excited to dig into this. So do you want to start us off with some thoughts about the feeding the 4,000?
Yeah, I think the feeding of the 4,000, there's a couple of similarities, obviously, with the feeding of the 5,000. And so to frame the 4,000, Mark put both stories in there for a reason. And there are some commentators that believe they're actually just the same story, the feeding of the 5 and the 4, but there are many things that occur both in this passage and in the next passage where it's obvious, no, it's not two different things, it's actually one. It's not one story, it's two different stories. And so I think it's important to remember that Jesus right now is in the middle of Gentile territory. So he's not with the Jewish people like he was with the feeding of the 5,000. He is with Gentiles, which for those that don't know are just non-Jewish people. That's what Jewish people refer to as non-Jewish people. And yeah, it's really interesting because it talks about how there's a crowd that's been following Jesus and Jesus feels sorry for them because they've remained for him for around 3 days, I think. Yes, they've been with me for 3 days. And so the word that Jesus used there for remained is the Greek word prosmenion. And it's not just like the normal type of following someone. It's actually a special type of commitment where they're there for the long haul and they want to be there. And it's just real interesting that Jesus has this type of commitment from non-Jewish people as opposed to the people that like his own people, the Jewish people. No one has had that sort of commitment to him, except for the disciples, obviously. But, just average people aren't following Jesus in the Jewish world like these Gentile people are doing here, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, so Jesus obviously has compassion for them. The Greek word, again, for this passage is super, super important. The Greek word for compassion is splangezomai. Splangezomai. And it actually comes from the Greek word splangenon. And splangenon is whenever the people would sacrifice animals and whatnot, the splangenion would be the heart, the lungs, the liver, and the kidneys. And they were eaten by the priest and sacrificed on the altar before the Lord. And so this idea, they connected this word to the idea of compassion because compassion means that it comes from like deep within your gut. And so Jesus had this kind of gut-wrenching compassion for the people that were following him these last couple of days. And he wants to do something about it. But what about you? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah.
Jump in.
I just love that idea. That word, it's like an anatomy term, which is kind of bizarre to use, but it's like Jesus has moved like so deeply from the inside. And I think about man, how cool is that like Jesus has moved like that, not just for the Jewish people, but for the Gentile people. There's like a matching compassion. And I guess some of the points of difference between these stories are really interesting. When he's talking about the Jews, he refers to them as being like sheep without a shepherd, but that doesn't come up here. Yeah. Because it's a different landscape. Again, it's got Gentiles there, right? But instead, it's that moved with total compassion for them.
Yep.
They've never had a chance to know the shepherd, right? Whereas the Israelites, there's a lot of comparisons between the story of the Israelites lost in the wilderness and God feeding them. Whereas here, I guess there is a little bit, but not as much. But yeah, I also saw some really interesting things about the numbers. I don't know if you came across this in what you were reading, but some scholars, and I don't know if I agree or not. I have to think about it a bit more, and also maybe I need to be a bit smarter. But but some scholars actually argue that with this story, how it finished with 7 basketfuls. Yep. Whereas with the first story, the feeding the 5,000, it finishes with 12 basketfuls of leftovers, which is obviously symbolic for 12 tribes of Israel and one for all of the disciples as well. But in this one, they only get 7 baskets. And some scholars believe that that's because 7, while it can be in the Bible, it's obviously known as a holy number. It can also be a number that connection to the Gentile tribes. Like they say that this is the land of the 7 Gentile tribes. And so there's 7 basketfuls left over. So it's like there's enough for Jesus for all the tribes of Israel. But then in this story, there's also enough for Jesus for all the world of the Gentiles as well.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, which is really cool. I thought it was a really interesting idea. And yeah, I guess like just as you read this story, it's just so bizarre how similar. This is like, I don't know, the weird section of Mark, in my opinion. Like how you get this weird like mirror story and these strange healings. But just the fact that they go through all of this again, and yet the disciples are still doubting.
Yep.
Like they're still unsure. And I find their responses a little bit interesting too. In the first story, the disciples, when Jesus said, like, you feed them, they're like, oh, where are we going to get enough money to buy food for all of these people, right? Whereas in this story, their question is, but where can they go to buy their own food?
Yep.
You know? Like when there's Gentiles involved, it's like the disciples don't really seem to want to buy the food for them. They're like, oh, but like there's no supermarket around or whatever. Like where are they going to go? Whereas Jesus still wants them to do it, right?
Yeah, wow.
So I guess to me this story is interesting because again, it's Jesus breaking those barriers between the Jewish world and the Gentile world, right? We had that healing of the woman that in that last chapter that we read, and now in this, it's like the feeding of them as well.
Yep.
So yeah, and obviously there was a lot of there was the whole like clean and unclean thing as well that we looked at in the last chapter. But in this one, it's like they're eating with Gentile people too.
Yeah.
Because they're all sharing this meal that's provided by Jesus together. So Jesus is just not just like he's like smashing the barriers between the Jewish and the Gentile world here. And what an awesome reminder for us, I guess, to I don't know, it can be so easy for the Christian world to put up borders between people, you know? But again, Jesus wants us to cross to the other side of the room, to be with the other, to be with those who are different, to not just be looking at ourselves all the time, but to be looking out and to be moving, to be being with people all the time. So those are some thoughts. I think that's all the thoughts I had on that particular area. But yeah, anything else to add?
Are you done with the 4,000? Sorry.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh yeah, got a couple of extra thoughts.
Great.
When Jesus gave thanks for the meal in the 5,000, the language that Jesus used is a language referring to the Jewish custom of giving thanks and the Jewish prayers for grace, basically.
Yep.
But the language that Jesus used here is a little bit different, and it's the same language connected to the Christian idea of like giving thanks for a meal, but not just giving thanks for a meal, but also the same word tied to the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And so it's almost like this feast that is open to all the Gentiles following Jesus in this story is kind of foreshadowing the fact that Jesus' table is open to anyone that follows him, which I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are a couple of similarities between this story, the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000 that I thought would be interesting. Both occur in a deserted place. Both emphasize Jesus' compassion for the crowds. Both repeat the question, how many loaves do you had? Both command the crowd to recline, and there's prayer in both. But in both groups, the people ate and were satisfied. In both, there were leftovers, and both conclude with Jesus dismissing the crowd and taking a boat trip after. So, that's a big reason why some scholars believe it's just the same story. But there are obviously differences when you look at the numbers and whatnot that occurred that make it a different story altogether. And I think Mark emphasizing that it's a Gentile audience that is listening to Jesus and following Jesus here. It's fulfilling one of the promises given in Isaiah and Jeremiah, where it talks about how in the future, God was prophesying, and the prophets were prophesying in the Old Testament time, that there's going to be a future ingathering of the people of God from distant Gentile lands. And so this story, probably Mark put it here to show that ingathering that was prophesied in the future is actually happening in the now.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, they were living out prophecy, essentially, which I just think is so cool.
Yeah. Actually, I think it's the same words used. When it says like, when Jesus says, because some of them have come a long distance.
Yeah.
I think if you read the Greek version of like Jeremiah and Isaiah, it's the same like words they use there, that long distance. They've come from these like faraway lands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so awesome.
Yeah.
They were literally living out the prophecies that were living there too. And a couple more things, and then I'm done with the feeding of the 4,000. Number one, I just thought it was cool when the story finished. It says that they were satisfied, and when the disciples asked the question, they basically ask, "Hey, where can they go and eat so that they can how are they supposed to find enough food to feed them?" And the Greek word for there is the same Greek word used for satisfied at the end of the story.
Oh, nice.
And so it's kind of like Mark is framing the question and answer. It's like, well, who can satisfy them? The answer is Jesus can satisfy them. And that's not just for the Gentile crowd that was there. Mark put that story because he knew that he was having a Gentile audience, and he wanted them to know, like, Jesus is the person that can satisfy them. And I thought that's super cool. And so the numbers thing as well, like you were kind of saying before, 7, number of completion, holy number in the Jewish world. But it's also linked to Gentiles. And like you were saying, the only thing that I wanted to add to that is that in the Jewish tradition, Gentiles who were not Israelites but wanted to be a part of like God's people, they didn't have to keep like the Torah per se, but they were bound to the covenant that God made with Noah in Genesis chapter 9. And so I did a little bit of research on the covenant and Noah, and in the covenant of Noah, there are 7 commandments. And commandment number 1, establish laws. Commandment number 2, don't commit blasphemy. Don't commit idolatry. Don't commit adultery. Don't commit bloodshed. Don't steal. And don't eat the blood of a living animal. So there were the 7 commandments of the covenant of Noah that people that weren't Jewish that wanted to be a part of that family had to keep. And so it's kind of like Jesus, that number is also linked to the Gentiles, that 7 number, to show like Jesus is for everyone too. And so story of the 4,000, the reason why it's there, crazy awesome things for us. Because we're Gentiles.
Yeah. And the awesome connection as well between like the conversation with the Syrophoenician woman. She's talking about like the breadcrumbs under the table for the dogs.
So true.
And then like literally a chapter later, they're actually fed with bread by Jesus, like the Gentiles are.
Literally like the next story.
Literally, next story. So cool, eh? Well, there's a deaf man in between, but definitely.
Oh, yeah, true.
But still, close.
Sorry,
Close enough. All right. So they get the basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 people were there. So then afterwards, they go on a boat. And as they're heading off, the Pharisees came and began to... when they arrived to the region, the Pharisees come and they question Jesus. You just know as soon as the Pharisees come and start questioning, like, it's about to go down.
It's about to go down.
We're about to get some, like, serious stuff. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply, which I love that. Just, like, you can just imagine it. It's like... it's so relatable. I love it. All right. Okay. Why does this generation ask for a sign? I feel like this whole thing is so ridiculous that the Pharisees are asking for a sign. Like, we've literally just come off. He's fed 4,000 people with like a lunchbox worth of food. He healed a deaf and mute man. And before that, he, he fed 5,000 before that as well. Like, why are they asking for a sign? They've already got signs, but they're just not believing them, right? So it's a very strange thing for the Pharisees to do, but I think there is a bit to the wording. So they're asking for a sign from heaven, but I guess the language that they probably should have used is like a sign from God, if that makes sense. Like they're looking for something particular, and I think that's why it riles Jesus up so much.
And for those that maybe don't know what a sign is, like why they're asking for a sign and not a miracle, a sign is something that happened in Scripture. It's basically, the term sign is used in the Old Testament to refer to God's miraculous work in rescuing Egypt from slavery. And it's basically like a demonstration of God's power over the circumstances that Israel or God's people find themselves in. And so signs were basically God's way of validating He's moving, He's there. And so signs weren't just, this happened, all right, let's believe it. People could commit false signs. And so one of the ways to determine whether someone was committing a false sign was whether it was in line with the Torah, and the teachings of the Torah. And so the Torah, it's in the Torah, it kind of warns people, hey, don't just follow people that do signs. Follow people that do signs and that are in line with like God's message, because there are people that can do signs that aren't following God. And so, but like that's why they were so, like they were asking Jesus for a sign, because they'd seen all these miracles, but they were like, well, how do we know that you're of God, essentially?
Yeah.
And so I'll let you continue.
Oh, well, there's not much to it. It's just, and this is what I love. He's just like, no sign will be given to you. And then he gets in the boat and goes. Like, it's such a mic drop moment.
How funny, hey?
Yeah, and he crosses over to the other side. He's like, no, we're not doing this. This is ridiculous.
Yep.
And I think, it's a really interesting link. Hold on to the thought, I think. I think it's best to just power through, and then I want to circle back to this story a little bit later.
Let's do it.
So then he left them. They go back into the boat. They cross the other side. And the disciples had forgotten to bring bread.
Classic.
Yeah. It's such a throwaway sentence, but anyway. So except the one loaf they had with them. And so you don't really hear what they say about this, but obviously the fact that it's mentioned means it must have been a big enough deal for the disciples to talk about this story, right? So like they're the only ones in the boat, so this story must have been passed through that like, oh, they went out of the boat and they only had one loaf of bread, and all of a sudden they must have been, the story implies that they must have been a bit flustered, a bit freaked out because this isn't enough bread for all of them.
Yeah.
Which is, again, like, are you serious? Like Jesus just fed 4,000 people right after feeding 5,000 people, and you're stressed out that one loaf of bread isn't enough for 12 people in the presence of Jesus.
It's kind of whack.
It is. It's a bit crazy. Like, I mean, I don't know. It just, anyway. Okay, so Jesus says, be careful, Jesus warned. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And they discussed with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of the discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they said. And when I broke 7 loaves and 4,000, how many basketfuls did you pick up? They answered 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? Like you can almost, like the frustration is almost like oozing off the page, right? Yep. But yeah, any thoughts from you, Josh, on this?
Well, I'm excited to, I can see you're building to something.
Oh, well, you know.
So I want to see you just keep going, just build.
Well, it's just, there's a spiritual blindness here, right?
Yeah.
There was a spiritual blindness from the Pharisees. They were seeing these signs, but they weren't attributing them to the signs. They were just seeing these works, but they weren't seeing it of God. And the disciples are experiencing this blindness. But again, they've been with Jesus and they're still not seeing what he's capable of enough. They're still, what he's capable of. They're still not trusting in him fully. They're still not recognizing that he is always enough. He is that satisfaction you were talking about. They're still freaking out about this stuff. And so a quick word, when Jesus says, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees. So the yeast here is kind of an interesting, I don't know, I didn't really understand this for a while. I still struggle to understand I don't bake bread, so I don't know much about this stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
But what I understand is that yeast is like a part of the bread, or like a part of when you're making this thing. Actually, where's my note? Give me a second. Sorry. I took a screenshot of it on my iPad, but I realized I didn't put that in my notes, and so we're doing the awkward double device setup right now. But yeah, the yeast. When I've seen this in the past, I haven't really thought much of it because I didn't really understand what it was all about. But when Jesus warns his disciples of the leaven, the Pharisees, leaven was in various contexts a synonym for corruption, right? And I guess if you read something like 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 to 8, it says, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump. Why don't we sing about that in church, I want to be a new lump,
New wine? No, I want to be a new lump.
I want to be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth.
Yeah, wow.
So that link here is that like this yeast is sort of representing this corruption that can go out. And the thing is, I think if you leave it long enough, the yeast can like turn the whole bread bad, right? It can even become poisonous, as far as I understand. But again, I'm not a baker, so maybe bakers, if you're watching this, correct me if I'm wrong.
And send us some bread.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he's saying like, watch out for this. Like there is something wrong in that is something that can get in and it can corrupt you if you let these ideas that the Pharisees have get in you. And even the ideas of Herod, there is something that can corrupt you from within these.
Yep.
And a symptom of that seems to be that spiritual blindness.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's starting to see the spiritual blindness and he's like, watch out. There is a yeast within you.
Yep.
And it's the same thing that's in the Pharisees. It's the same thing that's in Herod. Which would be pretty like eye-opening. Well, eye-opening, pardon the pun, but I mean like, it'd be pretty like shocking to hear that. You're like, oh, I'm realizing. And then they still don't get it. That's the whole thing they say. It's because we have no bread, right? It's no. It's, we have Jesus. It's that we're allowing him to purify into like that prayer in the Psalms of like, search my heart. See if there is any offensive way in me, Lord. And what a prayer to keep praying.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Did you have any? I feel like I've been talking for ages. Did you have anything to add to this?
The only thing I would add was, when Jesus, after Jesus kind of says, I'm not talking about bread. Like, why are you arguing about real bread?
Yeah.
When he says, you have eyes, can't you see? You have ears, can't you hear? All that. It's actually quoting from Jeremiah chapter 5. And in Jeremiah chapter 5, it's actually a prophecy where God is speaking to Israel and basically just addressing the fact that they are failing to acknowledge who he is, and that's why they're getting into a lot of the messes that they're making. And it's almost like, for me, when I am reflecting off what you're saying, it's Jesus' way of reminding his disciples, hey, like the people of Israel back then, they failed to see who God was. They failed to acknowledge what Yahweh was doing in their midst. And because of that, they are in the situation that they're in now. And it's kind of telling them to not repeat the past mistakes of their ancestors, especially because right now they have like the ultimate revelation of who God is in Jesus Christ. And I just think that it's super important that Mark put that there, because it's not just a warning for the disciples. Because if it was just a warning for the disciples, it wouldn't have made this book. It's actually a warning for all of us, because I think that we can have our own preconceived ideas of who Jesus is, who God is, and also preconceived ideas about what's important to Jesus.
Yep.
And the disciples right now in this story, they thought what was important was the bread, but Jesus actually had an alternative, I guess, desire for what he wanted them to desire, and an alternative, agenda for what he wanted them to think about, and what he wanted their minds to be ruled by.
Yeah.
And so, it's just a reminder for us that 2,000 years later, reading and listening to this story, that let's watch our agendas. Let's watch our assumptions about who Jesus is, and let's not get caught in the weeds, and actually focus on what Jesus wants us to focus on, which is that he's the Lord, he's Lord, and he can do. He's the one that satisfies, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It also reminds me of so Isaiah chapter 6. There's like that part where he's in the temple and he's speaking to God, and then God's like, who will go? And then he's like, I'll go. The angel touches his mouth with the coal, and then he's like, you'll go. But, the people will be ever seeing, but never perceiving, ever hearing.
Yeah.
But, all that. It's that same sort of echo there.
Yeah.
But when I think about this, I think about how, at least in like Western Christianity, there are a lot of us who are very stuck with an image of God. And we can become so stuck with that we become closed-minded to what he's actually trying to say to us. There's a very westernized idea about Jesus and the gospel and church and what that should look like. And it's not all bad. Like a lot of it's dipped in truth, but there are some parts that we've just made. And the thing is, this is why it's so important to just keep reading the Gospels, because we need to let Jesus speak for himself and who he is and what he's all about. And a good test for this is if you think, if you're worried that you're being maybe not open to seeing Jesus for himself, is to think, have you made Jesus in your own image? If Jesus was alive today, if he would dress like you, vote like you, think like you. You're either a really awesome disciple of Jesus or you have made him to look just like you. And so what we need to do is this is why, I don't know, I try to read the Bible all the time and have a huge focus on the Gospels constantly. That's why I'm loving doing this podcast, because just the opportunity to keep looking at the words of Jesus and letting him speak for himself and allowing, instead of my mind to shape what he looks like as I read the Gospels, to allow the Gospels to shape my mind in who Jesus should be and how I should respond to that.
Yeah. I'm doing a sermon on the Lord's Prayer in a couple of weeks, and so I've been really steeped in like understanding each line. And it hit me this morning as I was doing some prep about the sermon, how important the line, holy is your name. Because, I used to just think that was the part of the line where you kind of just had to praise God and find things to praise God about. But really what it means to make God's name holy in your life, I can't remember the exact Bible passage that it is in. Oh, Ezekiel 36. What am I doing? Ezekiel 36.
Yeah.
Ezekiel 36 is basically God retelling the story of Israel, but through the fact that they have forgotten who his name was, like forgotten his reputation.
Yeah, wow.
And because they had forgotten who he was and his reputation, they'd gotten themselves into all the hectic stuff that they got themselves in, and all the hardship and all the trial.
Book of Judges, it's just a
it's
downward spiral. Yeah,
it's just so bad.
Yeah,
and I'm just at the end of that kind of passage, God said, "I'm going to make my name holy again. I'm going to set my name apart from your midst so that you can know me for who I am." And then it's just so interesting that Jesus is kind of riffing off that idea. And then he makes it like the second thing in the Lord's Prayer. After greeting God, it's then make your name holy. And it's, for me now, that line is just a reminder that because we all have our picture of God, the thing that we should address primarily in prayer, firstly in prayer after addressing God, is actually asking him to reveal to us who he is. Because we can't do that by ourselves. Yeah. And that's actually what the next story is all about. And that's probably a perfect link for us to transition to that story. But, the disciples, their eyes were blind. And many of us who follow Jesus, we have assumptions and misunderstandings about Jesus that we can't fix unless we get an outside source to help us. And that is what the next story is about, where the answer to the help that we need is Jesus himself. Because even though we're blind to him, it's him that allows us to see.
Well, spoiler alert, man. No,
okay. All right, let's dive into the next story then. Unless you had anything you wanted to say.
I think we've got to go to the next story. That's what's going to tie all this together.
Yep.
Yeah.
The next story is like the linchpin for Mark 8.
You want to lead us through it?
Yeah, well, Mark 8, in after the disciples get pumped in the boat,
Get pumped in the boat.
after Jesus savages them, they arrive in Bethsaida, and there's a blind man that is brought to Jesus, and so they beg him to heal him. And so Jesus kind of goes about another bizarre way of healing him. He just spits in the guy's eyes, which is pretty like, I hate saliva and stuff like that. So even when my son's, like, I carried my son the other day, he sneezed straight into my face. I wanted to cry and just throw him away. But anyway, so Jesus spits in this guy's face.
But you didn't actually throw him away.
I didn't actually.
You're a loving father. You care about your son.
Yes,
all right?
I do.
I just want to establish
he's a great guy. He's my best mate.
Yeah. But just before we move on. Yeah. Okay.
And so what happens next? It's actually it is the only miracle that Jesus does in 2 stages. And it's almost like it doesn't work the first time. And so Jesus spits in his eyes. He asks, "Hey, can you see now? What can you see?" And he's like, "Oh, I can see people, but they look like trees." And then Jesus continues the healing process by touching his eyes. And then his eyes were completely open. And so commentators note that this is the only healing story. That this story doesn't happen in Mark or Luke. It only happens...
It doesn't happen in Matthew or Luke?
It doesn't happen in Matthew or Luke.
Yep.
It only happens in Mark.
Yep.
And so commentators say, it's because Mark's audience and Luke's audience, they didn't want them to think that Jesus was bad at miracles, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
That's what commentators are saying.
Yeah.
But
like every commentary I read on this particular thing had a different idea of what it meant.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's why we read different commentators, guys. We bring different things to the table.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, like the reason why Mark brings up this story is just this idea that we kind of touched on before, that, when it comes to following Jesus, it's like a gradual journey. We're not all going to see things 100% clearly straight away. And that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we're not ready for the full revelation of who Jesus is in our life. Because following Jesus, as we will unpack in the next passage that we talk about, it actually involves sacrifice. It actually involves surrender. It involves coming to terms with certain things and letting go of certain things that we didn't want to let go of. But Jesus doesn't put that all on us at the beginning. And it's kind of this reminder, this story is a reminder that gradually Jesus reveals who he is over time. And that's a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. But what did you have to say about it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for a long time, I've had a lot of questions about this healing story. I've always found it so strange. I still think I have some questions about it, especially after reading like all these different commentators. But I got three ideas I want to share about it.
Okay.
So yeah, firstly, and the big idea is that obviously this story is meant to be read in light of these previous stories that we've read about the spiritual blindness that the Pharisees had, that the disciples had, and that again, Jesus is the one that opens our eyes. This is what, every time I start Bible studies with people, the first session is generally all about two things: getting to know the person, but then the second part of it is about how everything in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, it all points to Jesus. Old Testament is pointing forward to him. Gospels are about him. New Testament, everything after that is like pointing back at Jesus, helping us understand him for today, and pointing forward to when he comes again, right?
Yeah.
Jesus is the whole story of the Bible, period. And so the only way to understand the whole Bible is to look at it through the lens of the cross. You look at every part of the Bible through what it means in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's how you make sense of pretty much all the weird stuff in the Old Testament, basically. So you just look at it through, okay, what does this teach me about Jesus or my need for a savior? That's really what it's all about.
Yep.
And so I think this story illustrates that so well when you tie it to those previous stories, that if the disciples come to Jesus and they recognize their blindness, he brings healing and he opens their eyes, right? Secondly, one commentator that I read, John Dibdale, who does the Andrews Study Bible Notes, who I've mentioned a few times on this, he had a really interesting take on this. So he says, Jesus first used a common home remedy used in ancient world to give partial healing. Literally, like this was like a general healing that you just spit on your hands and rub it on whatever the injured.
Wow.
That was like a thing.
Yeah, okay.
And then, not only that, but Jesus actually asked if the man could see. Every other miracle he does, he never asks because he knows it worked. Whereas this one, he spits on his hands first and he does it. And then he asks, which is the same as what a doctor would do back then. He's like, oh, how's it going? Can you see? Same as what a doctor does today. They're like, did you feel any pain or whatever? And so he reckons, and then the second stage is Jesus touching him with his hands, right?
Yeah.
So John Dibdale reckons that the first is like the combination of medical and spiritual healing together.
Yeah.
So there's a physical side of our healing, but then there's also a spiritual side to our healing.
Yeah.
And he reckons that's what like Jesus here is like touching on both of those.
Whoa.
Yeah, really interesting. Hey,
That is an interesting thing.
And so yeah, like part of the reason like, our church runs hospitals and mission trips and, trains nurses and all that stuff is because we believe there's a physical side to healing, but then also the reason we have churches and chaplains and everything is because we believe there's also a spiritual side to healing, right?
Yeah.
And both accomplish full healing. But above that, the third idea is that this is a parable of hope for the disciples and for us as well, right? Like what you touched on as well, like it's a progressive understanding of Jesus. But the disciples now, at this point in the story, they see in part who Jesus is, right? They see a glimpse of who he is. But it's not until the cross and everything that happens that they're really going to fully get it,
Yep.
In the next chapter, we do get a big breakthrough with their seeing, which we'll get to, but on the next part of it. in the next episode. But yeah, but for us as well, it's that parable of hope that we get it now, but it's really once you come to the foot of the cross, that's when you get the full understanding of who Jesus is. And I love, obviously, this show is called Good Morning Eden, so we're always looking for those Garden of Eden links.
Yep.
The first thing the man sees is that everybody looks like trees. I don't know. I think maybe I've got like my conspiracy theory hat on, but I reckon that's like, he got a glimpse of that Eden picture.
Yeah.
He recognized that we all belong in that garden together and we're all to be grafted on to the vine of Jesus. That's the first thing he sees. He partially sees that. And then Jesus opens his eyes and he's like, oh, these are people, you know?
Yeah.
Right? But he sees the trees first.
Yeah. And that fits in with that Adventist guy's like idea of he had a spiritual healing and a physical healing.
Yeah.
Man, that's so cool.
So yeah, all these different things combed together from different commentaries. But yeah, literally every commentary I read just strung the story a different way. I was like, I don't know what to do with this. But yeah. Put it all together and it kind of works, you know?
100%.
So yeah, those are my thoughts on this story. But yeah, I just love the hope, the strange story, but how much hope it gives. Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this? Whoopsie. Before we do some reflections.
Yeah. For me, you know, Jesus faced so much opposition throughout this passage, from the Pharisees first and foremost, causing him to sigh deeply, and also the disciples. Different types of opposition, but opposition nonetheless. And it's just so interesting that even in the hardest times that Jesus' faith was tested, Jesus' life was tested, he never gave up on humans. And he always gave people hope. And, you know, the fact that we're finishing today off on the story of the blind man is just a reminder that, you know, that story is a reminder that Jesus will never give up on people.
Yeah.
Like he will always continue to persist, even when we don't understand who he is, when we make mistakes. And I think that's just a beautiful reminder for me, because I know that there are many times that I've misunderstood the gospel and I've misunderstood, I guess, what it is that Jesus wants of me to live. And yeah, it's just such a beautiful thing to know that over time he will open eyes for those that are willing to see and are willing to come and say, help.
Yeah. Yeah, I know so many people who have just seen miracle after miracle, and yet they're still so blasé towards God. You know, they're still so like, I don't know if he's real. And in my head, I'm like, but this happened and this happened and this, you know, like, how can you not see it? But then I also know that there's that same level of blindness in me, that there are so many ways that God is working. And I'm often just so blind to see it until I really stop and deliberately look for it.
Yep.
But there's a real hopeful side to this that, you know, right from that feeding of the 4,000, when the disciples still, and when they're on the boat, they still don't get it. There are so many times when I just miss what God is doing.
Yep.
But as I continue to come to my knees and pray that Jesus would open my eyes, there are more things I see. I probably still have some blindness that needs to be healed. But I'm seeing more and more, and I'm trying to keep my eyes open towards that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we do some reflection questions. Yeah. Do you want me to start, Josh?
How many do you have?
2.
All right, I got 1, so you can go first.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, connected to what I was just talking about. So yeah, we love to finish every episode off with some reflection questions. So whatever you're doing, just take a moment to reflect and think through, just I guess where you're at with God. And my first reflection question is, just like the disciples approached that moment of the feeding of 4,000, and by that point they really should have known that Jesus was going to provide. Do you feel like you have missed some moments God has acted, and you need to come back to Him as your sustainer and the one who can provide everything? Do you believe He's able?
Yeah. The reflection question I want us to think about today is, regardless of where the disciples were at on their understanding of Jesus, He was still able to use them. And so the question I have is, what may be holding you back from coming and being used by Jesus? And how might He want to use you in your circle of influence today to to be a blessing to the world around you.
Awesome. And finally, do you want to ask for healing of your spiritual blindness today? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging with us today and continuing going through the Gospel of Mark. That was episode 12. We'd love to hear your thoughts. One thing I'd love to hear thoughts about is I pronounce it Bethsaida. Josh pronounces it Bethsaida. How do you pronounce it? Who's right? Who's wrong? Are we both wrong? Maybe it's something else.
That's actually we're probably both wrong.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys. So, reach out. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're learning and maybe something that we missed in this passage that stands out to you. There's just so much to learn. We can't cover it all, but and we'd love it if you could leave a comment or a review wherever you're watching or listening. It helps the show out a lot. So. Our prayer for you is that you would experience a waking up to God's way of seeing things, that you would experience his Eden point of view again, and that as you go about your day, your week, you would see how God's moving, how he's providing. So be blessed, and we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.